Chances are one of two things is correct. You're either new to sewing, or you don't sew a whole lot, and you're not quite ready to invest in a serger, which I get. But we still need to be finishing our raw edges regardless, or else a couple washes of these garments are useless. It's gonna fray. But when you know it, I've got the answer. My name's Cornelius Quiring. What a logo. Editing corn, let's get into it. First, why we finish raw edges, and that's done to protect the threads within the fabric. Most fabrics tend to be woven, a bit like this graphic here. And through normal wear, through washing, those threads can become undone if it isn't protected, which will ruin the garment over time. First and simplest is the good old-fashioned zigzag stitch. I start by just reducing the stitch length a little bit. I also find it's good just to do a little trim to clean up the edge of the fabric. And then I want to make sure that when the needle's on the right-hand side, it lands right on the edge of the fabric, maybe even in 1 millimeter rather than out. And voila! It's also a good technique for finishing the raw edges on curves. If I'm looking to press my seam open to lie nice and flat, I'll end up zigzag stitching each side independently. If I can't be bothered, well then maybe I just zigzag stitch them together. Where I find it's particularly important to sew just inside the edge of the fabrics is with these light and delicate fabrics. Otherwise they just get chewed up underneath the feed dog. Next up, we've got the old flip and sew technique. I fold over a small amount of my seam allowance and then just press that to lay flat. Ooh. Oh! You'd think I'd have learned from my own videos that I need to use a tweezer. And then I just run a simple stitch along to hold that down and in place. And there we go. And then when I sew my two pieces of fabric together and press open the seam, just to make sure that it's always on the underside, and that makes for a decently clean finish. This same technique can also be used for curved seams. The trick I find is to just give it a gentle tug to lie flat when sewing curves. And that's the final product. Depending on the shape of the curve, it can present some bulking and warbling issues though. One other challenge this technique brings is that because it's open, the fabric to the right-hand side of our seam can start to fray. Which brings us to our next technique. A variation of the previous one, we now have the flip and sew it down / top stitching technique. Once you're done with this video, maybe go check out my website. See what I've all got going on in this sewing world. Some free patterns over there. This time, I start by just sewing my two pieces of fabric together and then press open that seam and then fold it underneath one more time and press that down. Fold it underneath on both sides, of course. And then from here, I top stitch it down right on the edge on both sides. And there we go. What's good about this technique is that it encases the raw edge, so we don't ever have to worry about any fraying. It does, of course, though, present top stitching lines on the outside of the garment. This technique can also work with curves, but It's definitely more challenging, time consuming, and I find that the result just isn't quite as clean as I would like. But of course, with more practice, it could probably work. Alternatively, if we don't want to go outwards, we can flip the fabric inwards and sew it together. The in technique, I'm going to call it. I have yet to sharpen these shears since I got them over 5 years ago, and they still cut great. You can get a pair right here at this URL. And if you do, you're supporting my content because I get a little kickback. So thank you. Cornelius./cut. I've once again done my regular sewing stitch, but instead of folding it back on itself, I'm going to fold it inwards this time. Like that. Flip it over. Do the same thing on the other side. And then I just run a stitch right along the edge and then close that on itself. And look at that, it's all encapsulated. There'll never be any fraying. It's a clean and tidy finish. This technique can even be used on rounded curves quite effectively and still creates a nice result. Notching the fabric is also a good way just to get everything to lie nice and flat when I fold it inwards. Some of the drawbacks though being that it can get rather bulky, especially when working with heavy fabrics like this denim here. Also, if you're a real perfectionist, it's hard to sometimes get the folds nice and even, so one side hangs over a little bit more. It does sit decently on the inside though, because it can be pushed off to one side. The more keen of you may notice that this is basically like a French seam, so let me show you how to do that next. It's essentially the same technique as the one that we just did, but in reverse order, doing the end bit first and then the final seam. Exclusive content alert on Patreon and even to YouTube members. Not only that, you get access to a group chat where you can talk to other like-minded folks, share things you're working on, get help with your projects, participate in weekly discussions. You might even get your name listed in this video that Editing Corn has put somewhere. And not only that, you're supporting me, which allows me to put more effort into this content. Win-win situation, if I do say so myself. All right, keep it moving, Editing Corn. Onwards. I'm going to start by having the wrong sides of the fabric touching each other, which is a little bit in reverse than normal. And then I'm going to sew right along the edge here, just on the inside. Just like that. From here, I'm just going to flip that open, press that to lie flat. Do it to the other direction just to really get that seam as crisp as can be, and then fully flip it over and then press that to lie nice and flat. Gorgeous. Then finally I run my regular stitch along here where I would normally sew my garment. Boom. French seam. It essentially just creates a cleaner finish on the edge here compared to that one that we just did a minute ago. If I wanted to, I could of course run a stitch along here again, like that, and it really just gets that seam on the edge there to sit nice and flat. Now, let's do the flat felled seam. Did you know I have a newsletter? If you sign up, I'll come to you instead of you having to look for me. I once again start by just doing my regular stitch as I normally would. And then I'm going to take just one of the two seam allowances and snip it off nice and close to the stitch. And I've got maybe 2 up to 3 millimeters or about 1/8 of an inch left there. The seam allowance that I didn't trim, I'm going to push over to the side that I did trim and then press that to lay nice and flat. Curl that extra seam allowance around like so. And then once again, I run a stitch right along the edge there. And there we go. That is the finished technique. What I like about this one is that it just really reduces the bulk. Do note that it's going to leave a single top stitch on the other side. This is a technique you'll often see down the side of a pair of jeans, for example. Another place you're going to see this is on sleeve caps, for example. I'm going to trim the seam allowance on the shoulder side here, not the sleeve cap itself. I'm going to press the seam one way first. You might be thinking to yourself, hold on, what's he got underneath there? It's a tailor's ham. And I've got a whole tutorial on exactly how to make one. Editing corn, link where need be. Once again, I'm going to snip notches into the curves of the fabric, fold them back on themselves and press them down. And yes, this is going to be trickier. And there we go. That is the inside of the flat felled seam. And the outside or finished side. Definitely a trickier one to do, editing corn. Moment of vulnerability. Let's show the first one that I did. I mean, between these various points I've got going on here, and then on the outside there, those are some shaky looking lines. And now if you've got all the time in the world and you want really beautiful little details, here's how to do the bound edge. Fun fact, I make websites for a living. That's why this video is so visually pleasing. First, I'm going to cut the fabric that's going to go on the edges. And I want to cut it at a 45-degree angle from the grain of the fabric. And the reason I do that is it just makes the fabric stretchier, which also makes it more likely to work around corners and things. I'm going to fold it in half and press that down. Once again, I'm going to tuck that raw edge inwards like that. I'm going to repeat that on the other side, folding it inwards like this. Whew. Okay, all right, I'm back to my tweezers. I've done my regular stitch here, and then the seam allowance underneath, I'm just going to tuck that away so it's not going to be affected. I'm going to take one of these little pieces of fabric. I'm going to open that up all the way. Then I'm going to align the two edges with each other. And then I sew right inside of that crease all the way along. Gorgeous. Now I can just go ahead and flip this all the way around to the other side. And the trick I find is to make sure that the edge is just past that seam that came through from the other side. I'm going to go ahead and just sew right on that edge. Beautiful. It's a really decorative, gorgeous way to finish a raw edge. This technique can also be used for curves, and this is where cutting it on a 45-degree angle is very important. As I'm sewing, I like to just give it a gentle tug with the top hand because that helps to stretch it out and curve it as need be. Voila! And there we go. That is a bunch of ways to finish the raw edges on fabric. My suggestion is to just try them out, play around, see which ones you like, which ones you don't like. And there you go. So if you made it all the way to the end here, well, thank you. Perhaps you want to watch another video right there. And do not subscribe if you don't plan on sticking around. High subscriber counts and low view counts don't look good. So ignore that button if you don't plan on sticking around.